The slave was known across the galaxy as the Crimson Wraith. Her name was forbidden, her presence whispered about in hushed tones. A warrior forged in the fires of rebellion, she was a living legend, a specter who had turned the tides of entire battles, defying the overlords of the Vran Dominion. She was untouchable, unstoppable, until she was betrayed. The chains that now bound her wrists glimmered faintly under the dull lighting of the auction hall, forged from some composite alloy designed to suppress her strength. The hall was filled with creatures of every species imaginable, long-limbed Xyrians, armored Zorkanites, and the ethereal Sylvestrian elites. All of them had gathered to witness the sale of a being they both feared and coveted. Behold! The auctioneer's voice boomed, a Skari with a carapace glinting in the spotlight. The Crimson Wraith herself, broken, tamed, and ready for your service. The crowd murmured with a mixture of disbelief and awe. No one truly believed she had been subdued. Her fiery eyes swept across the audience, defiant even now. The scars on her skin were a map of her life, a testament to the battles she'd survived. Her mere presence seemed to suck the air from the room. And then, from the shadows, a human stepped forward. The human's appearance caused an immediate stir. Among the towering, multi-limbed, and scaled alien species present, he looked almost fragile. Clad in unremarkable clothes and with no visible weapons, he appeared out of place, a curiosity at best, an anomaly at worst. Yet, as he stepped forward, there was a weight to his presence, something intangible but undeniable. The Crimson Wraith's piercing gaze locked onto him, her lips curling into a sneer. "Another fool," she muttered, her voice barely audible above the murmurs of the crowd. But there was something in his stride, in the way he held himself, that gave her pause. The auctioneer recovered quickly. "A human," he hissed, his mandibles clicking nervously. "What an unexpected guest. Surely, you jested bidding for such a dangerous prize." "I don't jest," the human replied calmly. His voice was steady, his tone even. He reached into his coat and produced a data chip, holding it aloft for the auctioneer to see. "This should cover the asking price." The room erupted into chaos. Several bidders objected, demanding that the auction be reopened, claiming the human's bid was invalid. The auctioneer glanced nervously at the data chip, then back at the crowd. But the human simply stood there, unmoved, his eyes never leaving the Crimson Wraith. "It's authentic," the auctioneer finally confirmed, his voice faltering. "The human wins." A hush fell over the room as the crowd parted, allowing the human to approach his purchase. The Crimson Wraith stood motionless, her expression unreadable as he stopped before her. "You don't look like much," she said, her voice laced with disdain. "Why would a fragile creature like you want someone like me? Planning to use me as a bodyguard? A weapon? Or perhaps you just want to gloat, to say you tamed the Crimson Wraith?" The human smiled faintly, his eyes meeting hers without flinching. "I didn't buy you to use you," he said quietly. "I bought you to set you free." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Even the auctioneer, who had been preparing to shuffle the other bidders away, froze in place. The crowd murmured in disbelief, and the Crimson Wraith herself blinked, momentarily stunned. "Freedom," she said, her voice sharp and skeptical. "You think a few words can erase these chains? Do you have any idea what I've done, what I am?" "I know exactly what you are," he replied. "And I know what you've endured. But I also know that if anyone deserves a second chance, it's you." She studied him, her fiery eyes narrowing. "And what's in it for you, human? No one does something like this without expecting something in return." The human's faint smile faded, replaced by an expression of quiet resolve. "What I want doesn't matter. What matters is that you get to decide who you want to be." For the first time in years, the Crimson Wraith felt something she couldn't quite name, an emotion that tugged at the edges of her hardened heart. It was unsettling, unfamiliar, and deeply unwelcome. "Release her," the human said, turning to the auctioneer. The Skari hesitated, glancing nervously at the crowd. "Sir, are you certain?" "Now," the human said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. With a resigned click of his mandibles, the auctioneer activated a remote. The suppressive alloy binding the Crimson Wraith's wrists hummed briefly before falling away. She rubbed her wrists, staring down at her freed hands as if they belonged to someone else. Then she looked up, her fiery gaze fixed on the human. "You're a fool," she said, her voice low. "You've made a mistake you can't take back." "Maybe," he admitted, his expression calm. "But it's my mistake to make." Before anyone could react, the Crimson Wraith lunged. Her hand shot out, gripping the human's throat. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she lifted him off the ground with ease, her strength fully returned. "You think this makes us even?" she snarled, her face inches from his. "You think I owe you anything?" The human didn't struggle, didn't even flinch. His eyes remained steady, meeting hers with a quiet intensity. "I don't want your gratitude," he said, his voice strained but unwavering. "I just want you to live, and choose what that life means." Something in his words struck a chord deep within her, a chord she hadn't felt in years. She growled in frustration, her grip tightening for a moment before she suddenly released him. He dropped to the ground, coughing but otherwise unharmed. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met," she said, her voice cold and hard, "or the stupidest. Either way, I'll play your game, for now." The human picked himself up, brushing off the dust. "Fair enough," he said, his voice calm despite the red marks on his throat. "My ship is docked nearby. Shall we?" She didn't respond, simply following him out of the auction hall. The crowd parted before her, their fear palpable. No one dared to stop them. As they walked through the dim corridors of the space station, she studied him closely. He was an enigma, this human, fearless in the face of death, yet strangely gentle. She couldn't decide whether to kill him outright or see where his strange plan would lead. When they reached his ship, a modest freighter docked in a quiet hangar, she stopped at the base of the ramp. "What's your name, human?" He turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "You can call me Elias." She nodded slowly, her lips curving into a faint, humorless smile. "You've set me free, Elias. But freedom comes with a price, and you may not like what it costs." Elias met her gaze, his eyes steady. "That's my risk to take." Without another word, she ascended the ramp, disappearing into the ship. Elias followed, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. The journey that followed would change not only their lives but the fate of the galaxy itself. For freedom, as the Crimson Wraith would soon discover, was not the absence of chains, but the power to forge her own destiny. The freighter was as unremarkable as Elias himself. Its corridors were narrow, its interior worn but functional. The Crimson Wraith's eyes roved over the space, cataloging every detail, the locations of escape hatches, concealed panels, and the pitiful excuse for a weapons locker she passed on her way to the main cabin. "You travel light," she said, her tone sharp with disapproval. Elias glanced at her as he keyed in a sequence on the console to initiate takeoff. "I prefer not to attract attention." "Too late for that," she muttered, crossing her arms as she leaned against the wall. The engines hummed to life, and the ship shuddered as it broke free of the station's docking clamps. Beyond the viewport, the swirling colors of hyperspace engulfed them. Elias turned away from the console and faced her, his expression calm but serious. "You didn't kill me," he said. "Why?" Her lips twisted into a wry smile. "Maybe I'm curious. Maybe I think you're too pathetic to bother with. Or maybe I'm just biding my time until I decide what to do with you." Elias chuckled softly, surprising her. "Fair enough. But I hope you'll give me a chance to prove I'm not as pathetic as I look." She snorted, shaking her head. "You've got a strange way of seeing the galaxy, Elias. People like me don't get second chances. We're weapons, tools, pawns in someone else's game. Freedom. That's a lie people tell themselves to feel better about their chains." His eyes softened, and for a moment, she thought he might argue. Instead, he simply said, "Maybe you're right. Or maybe you just haven't seen what freedom can really be." Her gaze hardened. "And you have." "I've seen enough to know it's worth fighting for," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She fell silent, her mind churning. The simplicity of his words unsettled her. She was used to manipulation, to the intricate web of lies and power plays that defined her life. Elias, by contrast, was maddeningly straightforward. She didn't trust him. But there was something about his calm confidence that gnawed at her, a quiet defiance that refused to be ignored. For the next few days, they fell into an uneasy routine. Elias gave her free rein of the ship, setting no boundaries save one: she wasn't allowed to harm him. She tested that rule more than once, looming over him with a predatory glint in her eyes. Each time, he met her gaze without fear, and each time, she backed down, though she couldn't quite explain why. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" she asked one evening as they sat in the small mess hall, the hum of the ship's engines a constant backdrop. Elias set down his cup of tea, his expression thoughtful. "Because I don't believe you want to kill me." She laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "You're either brave or stupid. Maybe both." "Maybe," he agreed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But I think you've had enough people treating you like a monster. I'd rather see who you are underneath all that anger." Her smile vanished, replaced by a glare. "Don't pretend to understand me. You don't know what I've been through." "You're right," he said simply. "I don't. But I'd like to." She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. But there was none, only quiet sincerity. It infuriated her. People like Elias weren't supposed to exist, not in her world. Their first stop was a remote outpost on the fringes of known space. Elias claimed he needed supplies, but the Crimson Wraith suspected there was more to it. She trailed behind him as they walked through the dusty settlement, her senses on high alert. The locals gave her a wide berth, their fear palpable. It was a feeling she was used to, one she'd come to rely on. But Elias moved through the crowd as if he belonged there, exchanging polite nods and casual greetings. It baffled her. How could someone so unremarkable inspire such ease in others? "Do you make friends everywhere you go?" she asked, her tone laced with sarcasm. He glanced at her, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "I try to leave places better than I found them." "Is that what you think you're doing with me?" she snapped, her voice low but sharp. "Fixing me? Making me better?" Elias stopped, turning to face her. "No," he said firmly. "You're not something that needs to be fixed. But I do think you deserve a chance to figure out who you are without anyone else telling you." His words struck a nerve, and for a moment, she was at a loss for how to respond. Before she could gather her thoughts, a group of armed mercenaries appeared, their leader, a hulking Zorkanite, grinning broadly. "Well, well," the leader rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. "If it isn't the Crimson Wraith. I'd heard rumors you'd been sold, but I didn't believe them. Seems I was wrong." The Wraith tensed, her hand twitching toward the blade at her side. Elias stepped forward, placing himself between her and the mercenaries. "Walk away," he said, his voice calm but firm. The Zorkanite laughed, a deep, guttural sound. "You've got guts, human. I'll give you that. But this one's got a lot of enemies, and there's a hefty price on her head." Elias's eyes narrowed. "She's not your prey." The mercenaries drew their weapons, their leader sneering. "And who's going to stop us?" "You." Before Elias could respond, the Crimson Wraith stepped forward, her fiery eyes blazing. "You want me," she growled, her voice low and dangerous. "Come and get me." The fight was over in seconds. She moved like a force of nature, her movements a blur as she disarmed and incapacitated the mercenaries with brutal efficiency. When it was over, she stood amidst the groaning bodies, her breathing steady, her expression cold. Elias watched her silently, his face unreadable. Finally, he said, "You didn't kill them." She glanced at him, surprised by the observation. "They weren't worth the effort." "Or maybe," he said gently, "you're starting to see another way." Her gaze hardened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned and stalked back toward the ship, leaving Elias to follow. The incident weighed on her mind as they continued their journey. For years, violence had been her only answer, her only means of survival. But Elias's quiet faith in her, his unwavering belief that she could be more, was beginning to chip away at the walls she'd built around herself. And as their path took them deeper into the galaxy, She began to wonder if he might be right. The Crimson Wraith sat in the cockpit of Elias's freighter, staring out into the endless void of space. Her hands rested idly on her knees, but her mind was far from still. The weight of her past pressed against her chest, heavier now than it had ever been. She thought of the rebellion she'd led, the lives she'd taken, and the faces of those who had once fought beside her, now long gone. "What's next?" she asked without looking back, her voice cutting through the hum of the ship's engines. Elias, seated at the console beside her, glanced up from the star maps he'd been studying. "That's up to you." Her lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. "You keep saying that. Do you really believe I can just decide to be someone else? That the galaxy will let me?" Elias leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap. "The galaxy doesn't get a say in who you are. Only you do." She finally turned to face him, her fiery eyes narrowing. "And what if I don't know who I want to be?" "Then you take the time to figure it out," he said simply. "No one's rushing you." His calm, unshakable demeanor was as maddening as ever, but she found it harder to resent him now. Over the weeks they'd traveled together, Elias had shown her a kind of patience and understanding she hadn't thought possible. He asked for nothing in return, gave her space when she needed it, and stood firm when she pushed too hard. It was unsettling, but also strangely comforting. She leaned back in her seat, letting out a long breath. "I don't know what you're trying to prove, Elias. But you're the first person I've met who doesn't look at me like I'm some kind of monster." "That's because I don't see a monster," he said quietly. "I see someone who's been through hell and still came out fighting." His words struck a nerve, and she looked away, her jaw tightening. Before she could respond, the ship's comm system crackled to life. "Unidentified vessel, this is the command ship Vran Fury. Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded." Her heart clenched at the sound of the name. The Vran Fury was the flagship of the Dominion fleet, and it could mean only one thing: they'd found her. The Wraith stood abruptly, her hands balling into fists. "They've come for me," she said, her voice low and hard. "I told you this would happen." Elias's expression didn't waver. "We'll handle it." Her eyes flashed with anger. "You don't understand. They won't stop until I'm dead. Or worse. You should have left me on that station." "Too late for that," he said, his tone calm but resolute. "And I wouldn't have, even if I could." The Wraith hesitated, caught off guard by the conviction in his voice. But there was no time to dwell on it. The Vran Fury was closing in fast, and escape was no longer an option. When the Dominion soldiers stormed the freighter, they found the Crimson Wraith waiting for them. She stood in the cargo bay, her stance relaxed but her eyes blazing with defiance. Elias stood beside her, unarmed but calm, as if he didn't care that he was outnumbered 10-1. The soldiers leveled their weapons, and their leader, a towering Vran officer, stepped forward. "Crimson Wraith," he said, his voice cold. "You've evaded justice for too long. Your time is up." She smirked, tilting her head. "Justice? Is that what you call slaughtering entire worlds?" The officer's eyes narrowed. "You are a traitor and a murderer. Surrender now, and I may grant your companion mercy." Elias stepped forward before she could respond. "She's not going anywhere with you." The officer sneered. "And who are you to make demands, human?" "Someone who believes people can change," Elias said evenly. "Someone who believes the Crimson Wraith is more than the monster you've made her out to be." The soldiers shifted uneasily, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. The Wraith stared at Elias, her heart pounding. No one had ever spoken up for her before. Not like this. Not at the risk of their own life. "You're a fool," the officer spat. "She'll kill you the first chance she gets." "Maybe," Elias said, his gaze unwavering. "But I'm willing to take that chance." The officer raised his weapon, and the Wraith moved without thinking. In a blur of motion, she disarmed the nearest soldier and turned his rifle on the others. The cargo bay erupted into chaos as she fought with a ferocity that reminded everyone why she was so feared. But this time, it was different. She didn't kill. She incapacitated, disarmed, and disabled, leaving her enemies alive but thoroughly defeated. When the last soldier fell, groaning and clutching a broken arm, she turned to face the officer. "You wanted the Crimson Wraith," she said, her voice cold as steel. "Here she is." The officer stared at her, his expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. "What are you waiting for?" he snarled. "Finish it." She hesitated, the rifle steady in her hands. But then she lowered it, her gaze hard. "No." The word hung in the air like a challenge. The officer's sneer faltered, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. "I'm done being what you made me," she said, her voice firm. "You don't control me anymore." Elias stepped beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Let them go," he said softly. "They'll spread the word. The Crimson Wraith isn't a weapon anymore." She nodded slowly, tossing the rifle aside. The officer glared at her but said nothing as he and his men retreated, dragging their wounded with them. Moments later, the Vran Fury disengaged, leaving the freighter alone in the vastness of space. In the silence that followed, the Wraith turned to Elias, her expression unreadable. "You're insane, you know that?" He smiled faintly. "I've been called worse." She shook her head, a reluctant smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in years, she felt something close to hope, a fragile, flickering ember, but real nonetheless. "So," she said, her voice softer than before. "What now?" Elias shrugged. "Whatever you want." She considered his words, the enormity of the choice before her. For the first time, her future was truly her own. And while the path ahead was uncertain, she knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't walk it alone. "I guess we'll see," she said, her fiery eyes meeting his. "But if you're coming with me, you'd better keep up." Elias grinned. "I'll do my best." And as the freighter soared into the stars, the Crimson Wraith began her journey. Not as a weapon, not as a slave, but as a woman reclaiming her destiny.